Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you 15 of my favourite podcasts. Now, 15's a lot, so I'm going to try and be really quick, but before I start I must tell you to subscribe because I know that like 80% of people who watch my videos are not subscribed. So hit that button right now. Let's go. So I'm going to start with two related to crime, which is a very popular area in podcasts. There's a ton about murders, which I listen to, which are super interesting. But two of my favorites are Criminal. Every episode they look at a different crime in history. They're not always super gruesome. There was one where a B&B owner was taking photos of people asleep on their camera. So when they develop the photos when they get home, there was pictures of them asleep in their own beds on their camera. There's ones about people escaping from jail. There's obviously ones about murders, super interesting. And Serial is possibly the biggest podcast ever, and it was a really detailed look into one murder from about 20 years ago, I think, and the case, and looking at whether the case was correct or well-founded and whether they could get it retrialed. Season 1 was awesome. Season 2 I didn't even finish. The next three are all quite like serious, intellectual, quite heavy ones, but I really like them. The first one is Revisionist History, which is Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. Again, I thought season 1 was much better than season 2, but he looks into just kind of interesting anomalies and why the world is like it is. It's very hard to explain, but I would highly recommend it if you're kind of a thoughtful person and it's still reasonably mainstream. The second one is not particularly mainstream at all, but is 80,000 Hours, which is by the Effective Altruism group. I've actually just read the Effective Altruism book, and I think by the time this video goes up, there will be a video all about my mind-blown thoughts on effective altruism, so I definitely recommend watching that video first. But if you enjoy that video, you'll definitely enjoy their podcast. It's all about ethics and deciding which charities are the best use of money. For example, there's a really good episode that's an hour long, all about going vegetarian or vegan, why you should, why you shouldn't, how you can make the best impact, all that kind of thing. Very interesting. And the third one is a British one, which is More or Less. It's done by the BBC and they basically debunk numbers in the press. For example, nurses using food banks, which was a big title in a British newspaper. They look into, is that actually happening? Are the percentages as high as they say? Can percentages really be trusted? Because it depends how big the sample size is. All that kind of thing. So it's very good for looking at current affairs. They did a lot of episodes about Brexit when the vote was happening, so I'd really recommend it if you're interested in current affairs but also looking at numbers from a more critical viewpoint. Let's go from the serious ones to my favourite three comedies. The first one is The Guilty Feminist, which I absolutely love. It is I guess a stand-up show, kind of a discussion show with different guests every week where they talk about feminism from a kind of modern world perspective. So the tagline is "I'm a feminist but," and they'll say things like, "I'm a feminist but I would trade my voting rights if I wasn't in a marginal seat for Jennifer Aniston's hair." And so it talks about kind of things that we think maybe aren't feminist, and are they or aren't they? And it also covers a lot of current affairs like the nurses' strike. There's a lot on Brexit. There's a lot, they obviously did an episode for the 100 years since women got the vote. Super interesting, but also very amusing. So it's a good way to kind of combine getting educated and more woke with a really hilarious laugh out loud comedy. My next comedy could not really be more different, which is My Dad Wrote a Porno. Probably my favourite podcast ever. It is a guy about my age and two of his best friends, and his dad has written a really cringy, terrible porn book on Amazon Kindle, and they read the book one chapter at a time as an episode. And it is so funny. The book is obviously really cringe, like it's got cringy sex scenes in, but it also is really badly written. So one of the characters halfway through the chapter changes name because he just gets the name wrong. And they're all English literature graduates. So they're looking at how the commas are in the wrong place and the plot has no fluidity, and it's such a funny podcast. I cannot recommend it highly enough, but obviously 18 plus. And then my third comedy is No Such Thing as a Fish, which is from the writers of QI, which is kind of an amusing fact TV show in the UK. And it's often about animals or history, but it's about really funny, quite often rude or shocking facts, and it's just basically hilarious. If you want to be the kind of person who knows like random facts you can bring up at the pub, that's the podcast for you. Next are a couple of factual but not super heavy ones. The first one is Song Exploder, where they break down famous songs or really any song into all the different components, and they interview the musician of how they made it. And I find that fascinating. Like, how do you write a song? Where does it start? And they'll say, this particular drum sound, we actually put a blanket over the drum because we wanted to make it really muffled, or this sound is actually me just hitting a spoon on a glass. And it's so fascinating. I would highly recommend it. And then when you hear the song played in its entirety, you can hear all the different melodies and all the different sounds that they've put into the song, and it's totally fascinating if you're interested in music. And the other one is 99% Invisible, which is about design, often architecture, and they'll talk about, you know, the first skyscraper, or how air conditioning has revolutionized the way that houses are designed with lots more glass walls and not needing to be facing away from the sun, or things like that. And every episode is really different. It travels all across the world and all through time, and I find it very interesting just looking at elements of design, and it makes you look at the world in a very different way. Like, how do they make warning signs to go on trains? How do they decide what words to put on, what colour to make it? And I absolutely love it. It really follows me around in my daily life. Next, I've got two which are kind of techie but also very mainstream. You could listen to them even if you're not a tech founder like we are. The first one is Reply All, which they look into different elements of mainstream tech pop culture every week. So I just listened to one about them finding someone's Bitcoin on a lost wallet from 10 years ago. There's one about whether your phone is listening to you through like Amazon Alexa so that they can advertise to you better. There's one about who owns domain names, the people who buy and sell domain names. There's one about the history of Pepe the Frog, which is one of the most famous memes ever made. And I absolutely love it. It's always entertaining and very interesting and good for like bringing up in future conversations. And the other kind of techie one that I listen to is Startup, where it's week by week a guy who actually founded one of what is now the biggest podcast companies in the world. It's about his journey starting it and trying to get investment. And then future seasons, that's season one, but future seasons they follow other startups and interview startups on what it's really like. It's quite lighthearted, quite mainstream, very amusing, like not too heavy, but also interesting and factual. And then my final three are kind of the more, I guess, girly ones that are very lighthearted, just entertainment, almost more like a chat show. The first one I think is my favourite podcast out of everything that I listen to, and it's called The High-Low Show. And it's two journalists who are both British, and they look at the news that's happened in the past week. They do the podcast once a week, and they look at, as the name implies, highbrow and lowbrow. So they'll look at Kim Kardashian's latest Instagram, but then they'll also look at what's happening in politics, or they're both very well read, so they'll talk about new interesting articles or books that they're reading, and it's really fantastic. It covers such a range, it's very entertaining, and it keeps me up to date with current affairs. Then the next is The Heart of It, which is by blogger and YouTuber Estee Lalonde, and she's someone that I really love to follow. She's just done one season, but I think she's recording a second one at the moment. It's almost like a little monologue, although she does interview people, of just different various topics. So she does one about her mum, one about makeup, and they're just so interesting, and they're really well written. And I think for a first season, for someone who's never done a podcast before, it's just beautiful to listen to. I listened to pretty much the whole season in one sitting. So it's a bit of a curveball one, but I really enjoyed it, so I'd recommend that. And the final one is also from a blogger called Emma Gannon, and it's called Ctrl Alt Delete. And she interviews really interesting young people, kind of millennials, I guess, who are just doing interesting things. They're quite often startup founders or influencers or authors, and she just interviews really fascinating people, and she's a great interviewer. She doesn't spend too long talking about herself, which I find a lot of interviewers are quite selfish in their interview style. She's a very good interviewer and the topics are really, really interesting. So I would definitely recommend hers if you're interested in kind of the modern world and how young people are influencing it and creating the future. So those are my favourite podcasts, 15. I will include a list in the description box of literally all the podcasts that I subscribe to in case you want some other ideas outside of this. But let me know in the comments if you have a favourite podcast that I haven't included, because I would probably love to listen to it. Don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you next week. Thanks so much. Bye.